Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me, as always, is Dr. Patrick Wyman, and today we are looking back at UFC 222. It is episode number 201 of Heavy Hands, and while we joked at the end of last week's episode, Pat, that it was not a particularly momentous occasion, this latest UFC card. It didn't give us a particularly momentous occasion on which to celebrate our 200th episode. I will say, now we get 2 weeks off of UFC cards, which is kind of a lovely treat that I didn't realize how much I would appreciate, which means at the end of today's episode, we're going to have time to talk about two things we very rarely manage to talk about. Boxing, just a little bit, and heavy bag questions from our listeners. We're going to get to a few of them at the end of today's show. I'm looking forward to that. And until then, Pat, we have just a few fights to get through, to recap, to analyze in retrospect from UFC 222. Of course, the first of those is the main event. Cris Cyborg took on bantamweight Yana Kunitskaya in another utterly meaningless title fight, one that was really, let's face it, put together to save this card from total irrelevancy. But, you know, that being said, it had the tone of many of Cris Cyborg's fights. Hilariously, though, Yana Kunitskaya did take it upon herself to say last week that Cris Cyborg doesn't have real punching power. And it was impossible not to giggle thinking of those comments watching Cyborg, who essentially eschewed technique for good portions of this fight in favor of just winging right-hand bombs at Yana Kunitskaya over and over and over again. What did you make of the fight as it played out?
That was not my read on it.
Okay.
I thought that Kunitskaya was throwing lazy jabs out there, and so Cyborg was trying to throw right hands over the top of Kunitskaya's jab, as opposed to just kind of winging them. But it struck me that, like, she fought Holly Holm very much like a boxer. She fought her a lot with kind of tight footwork in tight spaces. She fought Kunitskaya like a chute box fighter. She fought her like she was going to walk her down and just kind of blast her with shots. Yeah, like the caught kicks into punches, things like that. Like that's what Shogun did to Corey Anderson.
Oh, that was a very Shogun
if you
move.
Recall. That's a thing that I can't tell you how many times I practiced that with my chute box coach back in the day. That's just a thing that you practice over and over and over again. I thought she fought her very much like kind of a march you down kickboxer, which was probably the right way to fight her. Not that, if we're being honest about it, there was a wrong way for her to fight Yana Kunitskaya, because Kunitskaya did not have shit to offer. Yeah. So, but you know, one of the key pieces of analysis, what little of it there was last week from us, focused on the fact that Kunitskaya, for all of the superficial similarities to someone like Holly Holm, cannot match Holm's ability to fight off the back foot and counter opponents on the way in. I think that more or less explains the difference in approach between Cyborg's Holm fight and this one. She had to fight Holly Holm much the way she did, even if it made her a little too hesitant at times. She approached that fight intelligently. In this case, the intelligent thing to do was to put a ton of pressure on Kunitskaya, get her to throw that jab, which she loves to throw, and then smash her in the face every single time she did it. It worked perfectly. I mean, it was quite a good approach. Yeah, I mean, we didn't learn anything new about Cyborg from this, aside from the fact that she's really good. But we already knew that. Like, let me ask you this, Connor, because I don't think there's much to say about the actual fight itself. How much tolerance do you have for watching Cyborg in squash matches at this point? Like, is this a thing you're just down to do every 4 or 5 months? Is like, let's watch Cyborg murder somebody. Or for you to have an interest in Cyborg, does it have to be her in there with good competition?
I mean, it's kind of running out, my interest in seeing these matches. And if I were the UFC, I would like to think that I would have used this last year, you know, this time in which Cyborg is taking squash matches. We can't make that Megan Anderson fight happen. You know, nobody cares about her fighting Tanya Evinger and Yana Kunitskaya because they're not even featherweights. I would like to have thought I would use that time to set up some other narratives in the division. Like, here are these people, here's how we're working them towards Cyborg, here are their chances, here's why you should actually care. But instead, it feels like we're going to have like at least another year of squash matches before we get to anything meaningful. I don't know. So it does. I'm already a little worn out by it, to be honest. I love watching Cyborg do her thing. She's really impressive, but you know, some of watching fighting is having questions about how the match is going to play out. And I was particularly confident that this one would not be very competitive.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, I think the only match that they're setting up for her is the Amanda Nunes one. And in fairness, that's probably the only really competitive fight for her in the UFC with somebody on the UFC roster at this point. Is the other champion.
Yeah, but unfortunately it also, I mean, I did argue on this very show on Heavy Hands a few episodes ago that that's like one of the super fights to make, but I'm now becoming a little more reluctant about the UFC's desperation to make super fights. Rather, I'm now reading it as desperation rather than opportunism, because like they're doing their best to cannibalize the tops of their divisions, to create vacancies for belts, and to basically destroy narratives that have taken some time to coalesce for basically a quick cash-out fights. There are so many ways that things like Dillashaw Johnson, Miocic Cormier, and Cyborg Nunes can go wrong for at least one of the divisions involved in each of those fights. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense.
Look at this. This Patrick Wyman guy over here had his mic muted while a phone call was coming in.
Yeah, no, it's a spam call for sure. I think Dillashaw Johnson is a little bit different than Nunes Cyborg, because there is nothing else to do with Nunes and Cyborg. There is no meaningful challenger at 135 unless you were going to throw Ketlin Vieira in there, which, like, sure, okay, all right, but then you go from one relatively anonymous Brazilian champion to another relatively anonymous Brazilian champion. Like, at this point, the only one with any real substantial name value there is Cyborg. Vieira's on a 3-fight winning streak. She could stand to get another win before you put her in there. Not that there's anybody with any name value for her to beat anyway.
Sure. But from a long-term perspective, what happens if Cyborg loses?
Then hopefully Amanda Nunes gets a little shine.
Yeah, but then you have no women's featherweight division. You created this division, now it's gone because it was created for Cyborg.
But that's exactly the point. They didn't create a division.
Okay.
They created Cyborg.
Cyborg only exists to eventually feed her to someone else that they want to promote.
Yeah, they have never held another women's featherweight fight. There is no division. There's Cyborg. And so, which I think is actually the right call here. I mean, people have talked about, we need to build challengers. Well, yeah, but there's nobody at 145, period, anywhere. It is not a viable division. There are not enough fighters to make a viable division. So why bother pretending? What you have is Cyborg and people who are going to try to beat Cyborg. That's it. That's the only thing.
Yeah, I guess that's fair from a certain perspective. You would still think they'd want to leverage Cyborg into some kind of long-term draw, though, right? Like, she does seem to draw fairly well compared to the vast majority of the UFC roster.
Sure. I mean, well, we'll find out exactly how well she draws after this fight. If she did more than like 225,000 buys on this, she's a star.
A genuine draw.
This day and age.
Right.
Yeah. With like 3 weeks to promote a fight with a non-entity, this is how we know. Yeah.
All right. Well, the mysteries of UFC matchmaking continue to perplex us. Where does Cyborg go from here? Who will be sacrificed to her next? Does the Nunes fight mean anything? All of these questions will hopefully be answered in the relatively near future. But before then, let's talk about the co-main event. Last week, this was the fight that we really wanted to discuss. It was sort of the people's main event in a lot of ways. We mourned the fact that it was not scheduled for 5 rounds. And as it turns out, it didn't even need to be scheduled for 3, because Brian Ortega knocked Frankie Edgar out in the first round. The first time the always finishes his opponent's guy has not gotten a 3rd round finish in some time was against Frankie Edgar, who has never been finished. I mean, how crazy was this to you? I was stunned by this result. I really was. Even though Frankie gets hurt early in fights, that's always when he gets hurt, and yada, yada, yada. Still, what a crazy, remarkable way for Brian Ortega to assert himself as the number one contender in the division.
It was, okay, despite it only going around, it was also a stereotypically Ortega fight in the sense that he was not winning up until the moment where he was.
Yeah.
Like, that's what really stood out to me about this, and what I don't think you can place enough emphasis on, is the fact that Edgar was absolutely on point. This was not a faded Edgar. There was nothing wrong with Frankie in this fight. In fact, this, I think, was probably the best version of him in terms of putting combinations together. His footwork was ultra sharp and ultra precise. He was taking great angles. He was putting his shots together really well. He had snap on his shots. Like, he had real snap and pop, especially on the right hands he was throwing. He was getting his weight behind his leg kicks. Like, this looked like a mature prime version of Frankie Edgar. This was not like a faded dude that Ortega beat up on the downslope of his career, you know? I think that's the most important thing to emphasize for me. And so the fact that Ortega was able to do what he did, especially on only a few weeks' notice, that magnifies like the accomplishment. It makes it so much more impressive, is that he beat a dude who was all there, who was 100% there, and he just knocked his fucking head off.
But what does it tell us about, like, what more do we know about Brian Ortega's skill set now that we didn't know before this fight? Do you have any more definite sort of frame or structure in your head that explains how Ortega's striking works?
So I think this is a case where you may lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Which is, if you try and dig down into the individual things, you kind of lose the general impression of Ortega's striking, which is that he's actually good. Like, capital A, capital G, actually good at striking. That if you try to break it down into various component parts, you could see the jab was there. That triple jab he threw at Frankie was really nice. He did a good job of setting the distance. Frankie did not have an easy time of getting into range to land his combinations. He was darting in and out, but he had to really think through it. He had to be really precise. What cost him was being a little predictable and tossing out that 1-2 yet again, because it was a counter left elbow over the top of Frankie's right hand that stunned him in the first place, right? Like, but that was a product of Edgar feeling like he needed to throw a 1-2 in order to cover the distance to get inside in the first place. That was a distance that Ortega set. Ortega's footwork is remarkable. It is remarkably good. He does a really good job of cutting angles in tight spaces. I think eventually, if he's faced with a guy who's going to really pressure him, I think Ortega's footwork will hold up really well under pressure.
Yeah, it does seem like it, because, I mean, Frankie's gotten pretty good at pressure fighting. He's always been better at it than people give him credit for, but at several featherweight fights since his move to featherweight, he has pressured really impressively. And
Uriah Faber.
Yeah, something he did quite a bit of in the first round of this fight, which I thought was a logical way to approach Brian Ortega, because honestly, Pat, as this fight crept closer, I was thinking more and more about what you said about Edgar being willing to use his grappling. And no, it didn't even go long enough to see if that would be a significant factor. He really only did the typical Frankie Edgar thing of, like, try for a few sort of throwaway takedowns just to establish the threat. But more and more as the fight approached, I was becoming kind of worried that Brian Ortega would be a problem for Edgar on the feet. I was worried that his reach would be a significant issue, because I think you can look back and see that, like, almost every time that Frankie Edgar has faced somebody who is much taller and longer than him, that's when he tends to have a little bit of difficulty, barring things like, like Jeremy Stevens cracking him or whatever. He tends to struggle against, like, Jose Aldo, somebody who uses long arms at long range. He had a surprising difficulty in his first featherweight fight with Chucky Olives. And I don't know, I was just thinking, like, Ortega's striking game is still sort of spotty. I still don't feel like I fully understand it. But if you watch his fights, you can see he knows his distance, and he does his best to maintain it. That was the thing that really stood out in this fight, is that Frankie had to work past a lot of business just to get into a range where he could land his shots. And he's good at that. He was using that jab. He was, as you said, using that 1-2, just sort of firing it to cover that gap. But eventually that kind of stuff gets risky against somebody who knows how to use their reach advantage. because
it gets risky if the person with the reach advantage knows how to use their feet. And that to me is what really stands out about Ortega. I think that it's kind of easy to miss this given how long and kind of awkward a lot of what he does looks, but his movement is really good. He never takes more steps than he needs to, really. Like, it's very tight, very precise, much more than you would expect for a guy who is as relatively inexperienced as Ortega is. Yeah. Like, but he's got really short, choppy footwork, you know? It's very good. And so Frankie, what has gotten Frankie by in the past, it's fundamentally sound too. His weight is always exactly where it needs to be. You never really see Ortega like lunging or reaching, do you? Like, nope. That's the thing that stands out about it. But that all starts with your feet.
Yeah, at times he seems to get hit, or like some of the stiltedness that you get out of watching his style work is like it's kind of more because he's doing things correctly and not because it's because he feels restricted to the techniques he's just learned. But that's kind of a good thing. You know, he's not willing to overextend or to leap out of range if it means scoring that shot or protecting himself this time, because he knows it's the wrong way to do it. So it's kind of only dawning on me now that when I look at Brian Ortega up to this point and I'm like, yeah, his striking's coming along, but it's not quite there yet. A lot of that is because I think it's coming along in the right way, that he is really trying to pay attention to the particulars of his technique and make sure that he's doing things correctly.
Yeah, even at the risk of, in the short term, finding himself in situations that do not really favor him or are not turning out the right way. Yeah. It's very process-oriented in ways that are hard to kind of spot at first glance. Like, what really strikes me the more I watch him is a broad similarity to Yoel Romero, which sounds absurd, right? Because Ortega is long and lanky for his weight class, and he's a grappler at heart. Romero is thick and explosive and a wrestler by trade. But what stands out about both of them is a lot of real fundamental soundness in terms of how they approach things. Like Yoel Romero's footwork is extremely fundamentally sound. Yeah. He tends to use it for big leaping movements, but at a basic level, he knows how to pivot. He knows how to turn. He knows how to sidestep. His basic footwork is really, really fundamentally sound. Yeah. Ortega's footwork is on a basic level really fundamentally sound. They're both very calm under pressure. They both read their opponents really, really well. And they're both playing a kind of a long game that is not necessarily a round-winning game. They're both finishers. They're looking for opportunities to finish, but in ways that do not necessarily lead to them winning rounds. So you can make an argument that Ortega has not won a round in the UFC.
Both exceedingly tactical fighters, like to a fault. Someday it will bite Brian Ortega. I have no doubt. It will hurt him that he does not seem to even pay attention to how the round as a whole is going or how the fight as a whole is going. But it also makes him uniquely dangerous because the vast majority of fighters do pay attention to that, and they are constantly worrying about the big picture. And Ortega is just like 100% focused on what's happening in front of him.
They're both worried. They're worried about big pictures, but they're worried about a different big picture.
Sure.
The big picture is, are you going to end up winning a 48-47 or 49-46 or 50-45 decision, or is that your big picture, or is your big picture, I'm trying to finish you within a 15 or 25 minute stretch?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think one of the ways in which it's easy to miss, and I think for so long we in particular and people in general kind of missed Romero's brilliance and have kind of missed Ortega's brilliance to some extent, is that those are both perfectly viable ways of approaching the big picture of a fight. Are you maximizing your chances of finishing? Not are you just throwing shit out there and trying to make it stick, but are you reading? Are you watching? Are you trying to figure out what is the thing that I can do that's going to finish my opponent? That is a perfectly viable way of approaching a fight strategically that does not happen to correlate to the other. You know, we're so used to seeing guys trying to win rounds, and if the finish happens, it happens. These guys are trying to finish you, and if they happen to win rounds, great.
Yeah, it is, barring the Nick Diaz fight, an approach that reminds me, the Romero comparison with all third-round knockouts is apt, but I am also reminded of Carlos Condit when I watch Brian Ortega. I think he could end up being the next stage of Carlos Condit type fighters, where he has that Condit thing where he remains remarkably poised. He doesn't seem shaken whatsoever if something hits him. Rather, he seems to immediately process that information and put it to use. He seems to take that like being punished for doing something as a very helpful reminder that he should now do the thing a different way, or that now that they've hit him with this shot, they'll be expecting to land it again, so I can counter them with this shot when they try for it. That was the kind of stuff that Carlos Condit was always extremely good at, that he was always hittable, and he really relied on his chin, and let's be honest, it looks like Ortega has a phenomenal chin as well. But Condit, his style worked for somebody who had a good chin, who could afford to take a hit, because you would be encouraged by what you had landed on him to then walk into a trap, essentially. He would turn your success into a trap against you. And that's really what I thought Ortega did to Edgar here. That Edgar got a little predictable throwing that left hook off the jab because he landed it a bunch of times. Was getting really good success with it and finishing every combination with that left hook. Ortega just spent the entire round basically getting a read on that shot, and then set up the finish with a perfectly timed counter, very Carlos Condit-esque, a perfectly timed inside elbow counter to the left hook. Didn't really move his head to make sure the left hook wouldn't land. Just knew the left hook was coming and thought, now's my chance to land a really hard shot as he tries that.
Yeah. The difference between Condit and Ortega, and part of the reason why I like Ortega as a developing fighter, is that Ortega's feet are so good, right? Like, he's so good at staying kind of over his feet and moving his feet, and his feet are a good and increasingly good first line of defense. Mm-hmm. But also he has defensive moves, right? Yeah. He does not have a defensive system yet, but he knows how to move his head. He knows how to parry shots. He's kind of got a sense for how to see his opponent's shots coming and to avoid them. And eventually, over time, it's not a given that this will happen, but that could turn into a pretty good defensive system. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which Condit never really developed.
Yeah, and it took him ages to really have like almost any kind of regular defense, and even then it was all rather rote, where it would be you would throw this, and then after that you just know that 90% of the time, after the right hand, they're going to counter with the left hook, so you roll under. Ortega is like using his eyes. And that's also why his footwork stands out, is that he doesn't immediately go to it. If he doesn't have to, he is willing, when he knows he's out of range and you extend something, to pick it off, to watch what's coming after it, to use his shoulder, to use his hands and his head movement. And just, it's not all there yet. But the fact is that he is in there observing what his opponent is doing and reacting accordingly in a way that a lot of MMA fighters still don't. And I can't say it's like he didn't win this round, up to the point he knocked Frankie Edgar out. It is a very different approach to the one that we're used to seeing. But at this point, it's really hard to say that there's not some seriously strong logic behind it, that it is not a process that works consistently. Because he just, for the guy who focuses on finishes, he just finished Frankie Edgar. And I think that's all that really needs to be said about that. Okay, so let's take a break. When we come back, we are going to move on to a couple other fights from this card. Sean O'Malley had an interesting and somewhat frustrating fight with Andre Sukumtat. We'll talk about that, as well as Cody Stamann, who I thought looked really sharp in a close win over Brian Caraway, who also looked quite sharp after a long layoff, and a couple other notable occurrences from this card and more after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's talk about Sean O'Malley. He fought Andre Sukumtat on the main card of this pay-per-view. Pat, what did you make of his performance in the fight as a whole?
He is Conor McGregor light.
Yes.
Like 10 pounds lighter, Conor McGregor. Like, he really, 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 really reminds me of McGregor in so many different ways. The kind of surprisingly deep game, the surprisingly broad game, the sense for what he wants to do in there, especially in terms of distance management, and what he can do when he holds the edge at distance. Like, that's all really kind of high-level advanced stuff. Early in this fight, the way that he very patiently stalked Sukumtat without giving him a ton of volume to work with, just building his feints layer by layer and throwing the occasional shot, all the while getting Sukumtat used to a distance that did not favor Sukumtat, like kind of conditioning Sukumtat to accept being all the way on the outside at a range where he couldn't hit O'Malley. That was really smart and really sharp.
Yeah, I was a little concerned after we talked about this fight last week, and then I did the vivisection with Zane Simon, and he pointed out like O'Malley's volume as a potential drawback, as a potential flaw. And I became somewhat concerned that O'Malley would maybe invite a pace that he couldn't actually maintain for the duration of the fight, and that he would turn Sukumtat into a more aggressive fighter than he normally is. And he really mitigated that risk quite well. Sukumtat is already a slower paced fighter than O'Malley, and O'Malley kind of dialed back to Sukumtat's pace, and not in a way that allowed Sukumtat to play his game, but one that allowed O'Malley to take advantage of the fact that he had an opponent in front of him who wasn't really pushing him, that he could just kind of stretch out and relax and not expend too much energy. I really appreciated how he put his feints together and got Sukumtat reacting and just made him a little too hesitant to do anything in the first round without having to do a ton himself. He didn't have to.
I disagree with you just a little bit. So you said that he dialed it back to Sukumtat's pace. He didn't dial it back to Sukumtat's pace. He pushed the slower pace himself while still holding the initiative.
Sure.
Right? It was his decision to fight at that slower pace rather than being sucked into one that Sukumtat wanted to fight at.
Yeah, definitely.
It's an important little distinction there. Like, O'Malley was always in control of who was throwing how much. Right? Yes. I think it's important to know. But anyway, sorry, go on.
No, I should perhaps say that he fought at what would normally have been more like Sukumtat's pace. But in this case, it was clearly the pace O'Malley wanted. He just had an opponent in front of him who was not naturally inclined. My God, my brain is working at half speed today, I swear. Who is not inclined to push the pace. And so it was okay for him to keep a relaxed pace as well. And he did it beautifully. We talked about his feints last week. I love that. I love the way he mixed things up. I'm a little concerned now he's going to be out of commission for a while. Some kind of horrible leg injury happened in this fight, and some people took it as good news when it was published just the other day. And this may have full news about this may have come out by the time this episode is published. But it was said online by someone that O'Malley had no broken bones, which kind of suggests to me, based on the way he was reacting, that in fact he tore a ligament. That maybe he hyperextended his ankle in kicking at Sukumtat's head, and that tore essentially the connective tissue between his foot and the rest of his leg, which would take a lot longer to heal than a broken bone and be potentially more long-term debilitating to O'Malley. So hopefully that's not the case. But let's talk very briefly about Sukumtat's decision-making in this fight. That was basically the big story here, is that because of O'Malley's wretched leg injury, it really seemed like Sukumtat had a window of opportunity, had a chance to win a fight that up to that point looked totally unwinnable for him. And yet he insisted on taking Sean O'Malley down repeatedly in the third round, despite having a clear chance to see that O'Malley could not actually stand, that he could not put weight on both feet, and Sukumtat kept trying to take him down. The fight may have been stopped just because O'Malley could not put up a fight on the feet if Sukumtat hadn't given him the chance to survive. Was that strange?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things here. The first is that I can understand, was this a failure of fight IQ? Absolutely. I'm not going to say that it wasn't a failure of fight IQ.
Yeah.
But I think it was a more understandable failure of fight IQ than we're giving Sukumtat credit for. Because what happened? Okay, so O'Malley hurts his foot. Sukumtat gets him down, right? What does O'Malley do? O'Malley doesn't accept ground position. He could have just tried to lock Sukumtat up and tried to hold him there on the ground. O'Malley didn't do that. He immediately tried to scramble back to his feet, which if you're Sukumtat and you're trying to think this through, suggests he doesn't want to be on the ground. I should try to take him down again. That's where he's losing this fight. Maybe that's where I can win the fight. Then O'Malley does manage to get back to his feet, I think a second time, and he manages to fucking smash Sukumtat with like a spinning thing, and he knees him, and like
he almost knocked him out with a spinning elbow while on literally one leg.
Yeah, and then he hits him a bunch more times. And so if you're Sukumtat, you're like, Jesus Christ, okay, I get him. He gets back up. Maybe he's injured, but he's still beating the shit out of me. Like, so of course Sukumtat takes him down again. I think it was only the last time where O'Malley manages to get back to his feet, and he's very clearly hobbled. And that was with what, like 2 minutes left, something like that.
It was like a minute 30 seconds. It was a not insubstantial amount of time.
I think it was only that last takedown that was kind of unforgivable.
Yeah.
Where O'Malley was clearly in horrendous pain. But like at that point, I can still see if you're Sukumtat, you're like, okay, I'm going to get this guy down. What is he going to do? I can submit him. I can beat him up with punches from the top. If his leg's that injured, it's going to hamper him grappling too. I can still see it. I think we shouldn't be quite as harsh on Sukumtat. Like, did he fuck up? Yes, absolutely. That was a tremendous fuck up. But give credit to O'Malley for still making it hell on Sukumtat when he did get back to his feet. It wasn't like he rolled over on the feet and collapsed back down to the ground. He was still trying to beat up Sukumtat. He
tried to Karate Kid him. Like he was trying to set him up for something while bouncing on one working leg. And I tend to side with you. Like I was going to point out that I think this is the worst beating on the feet Sukumtat has probably ever experienced.
He beat the shit out of him.
Yeah, I mean, he was like, I don't really fault the guy for maybe like he got hurt several times in this fight. I don't really fault him for maybe losing his cool a bit. I mean, yes, you can say he should have maintained his composure, and of course that is easier said than done. He was getting his ass whooped as a striker in a way that has never happened to him. You know, like other losses, Albert Morales and Alejandro Perez didn't do this kind of stuff to him. He couldn't lay a hand on O'Malley at range. He couldn't touch him. And O'Malley was just hurting him with almost everything he threw at a certain point. So, you know, I don't fault him for maybe not realizing in the moment, hey, I suddenly have an advantage on the feet that has not been there for the preceding 13 minutes, you know.
He was also more than a little concussed. It's worth bearing in mind. Like O'Malley had really scrambled his brains there at the end of the second round. It's a miracle that fight wasn't stopped. Like for those of our listeners who have not been concussed, it does not do great things to your ability to think rationally through situations while under tremendous pressure.
Yeah, not generally.
So it's just worth bearing that in mind. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this wasn't a fuck up. It was a fuck up. But the question is, how much credit does O'Malley deserve for fighting through that? I think a ton.
Yes.
I think he deserves an enormous amount of credit for that. That was incredibly gutsy. And like, there's a way in which what Sukumtat did, how he handled that, was perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
Under the circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's talk about Cody Stamann.
Oh, real quick, one more thing I want to say about O'Malley.
Mm-hmm.
In this might actually be a good thing for him camp is the fact that this was O'Malley's 5th fight in the last 12 months.
You know, they would have given him the Mike Perry schedule if they could.
Yeah, they absolutely would have.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's like, give the guy a little break. He needs probably 6 months off. Even leaving aside the injury, the guy needs 6 months off.
Yeah, I mean, having your foot removed from the rest of your leg while still being attached with skin is maybe not the best way to get a vacation. But, you know, maybe O'Malley can use a little vacation before the UFC, you know, does their best to destroy him as they do with all of their promising talent.
Yeah. One more thing about that. Who do you want to see him fight next? What is the right matchup for him?
Oh, gosh. I mean, God, bantamweight is so amazing now. There are so many fucking options, dude. Who's a reasonably low-ranked enough opponent. Like, I wouldn't mind seeing O'Malley take on someone the caliber of the other guys who have beaten Sukumtat. Like, I wouldn't mind seeing O'Malley versus an Alejandro Perez, a tough, crafty fighter who will kind of try some tricks at his range. I wouldn't mind seeing him against a really sharp counterpuncher where Sukumtat kind of failed. Maybe somebody like a
Rob Font.
Or
do you think that's too high up?
Yeah, I mean, down the road, those are the kind of... I mean, there's so many tempting matchups at 135, but I would like to see O'Malley brought along a little more carefully than that. He's obviously a tremendous talent, but he's also 23, and this was his 10th fight.
Yeah.
So
it's hard because there's... the upper echelons of this division are packed with guys who would be just tremendously fun matchups for him.
Yeah.
But he's so young, you've kind of got to take a step back and be like, okay, I liked your Alejandro Perez suggestion. I think if he's fighting Matthew Lopez next month, I think the winner of that fight is a good option. You could do, this might be a little too much given the wrestling, but Frankie Saenz, they may train together though. I'm not sure.
Don't know. Yeah. That will be an interesting one. There's also
Augusto Mendez. That's the right fight. That is the right fight for Sean O'Malley.
Yeah, I like that. Somebody who's definitely dangerous and capable, but a little more crude. Somebody who will play into O'Malley's style without being a pushover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that.
Even if he's God knows, maybe he'll emerge for his once yearly fight. But Johnny Eduardo too, even though he's coming off a loss.
Yeah, well, now I think it's going to be 2 years between every fight for Johnny Eduardo. He's never going to retire, but he is going to continue taking longer and longer vacations between bouts. I like the sound of some of those matchups. I know that they will. They absolutely will rush him as fast as they can because they have no patience for anything. But I would like to see a somewhat measured approach with someone like Sean O'Malley because I think he proved in this fight, if it wasn't proven already, he is a genuinely top-notch talent. He is a fighter that deserves to be developed, not just thrown into fight after fight.
Yeah. So moving on to another talented young bantamweight, yes. Cody Stamann.
Speaking of how awesome bantamweight is, Cody Stamann was essentially nobody at the start of last year. And then he came in, he had a good fight with Terrion Ware. Same guy who fought Sean O'Malley first, right? So they're using Terrion Ware the way they probably should use him. Like, okay, we have a hot new talent. Let's make them fight Terrion Ware, this guy who is like literally MMA's version of a crafty journeyman boxer. I'm pretty sure
They've got Tom Duquesnoy fighting Terrion Ware next.
Perfect.
Speaking of talented bantamweight prospects.
I feel bad for Terrion Ware because I really do enjoy his style, but that is cynically the way a promotion should use somebody like Terrion Ware. Yeah. Cody Stamann was nobody. He fought Terrion Ware, and we were all like, wow, that was a strong performance. How does that grade upwards? And we see him fight Tom Duquesnoy. We all expected Tom Duquesnoy to win, and Stamann beautifully neutralizes Tom Duquesnoy and ends up taking the fight to him. You and I both thought that ability to dictate the direction of a fight and the pace would be of key importance against Brian Caraway, who, like Tom Duquesnoy, likes to pressure, but is also a wrestler and not Tom Duquesnoy. I was still a little concerned with how Stamann would deal with the constant takedown threat of Caraway and the chain takedowns and the crazy ways that Caraway can steal a dominant position out of a scramble when it seems like you've escaped him. And Cody Stamann shut him down just as effectively as he did Tom Duquesnoy. He really did. It was like that Duquesnoy fight, still relatively close. Stamann couldn't run away with it. But after the first round, he sort of systematically neutralized everything Caraway wanted to do. And I don't know, man. I kind of blown away by this performance. Like, Stamann looked phenomenally calm and composed. His athleticism really, really shown how fast he is, how quickly he can get out of range and hop back in, and just his versatility. Like, he didn't seem shook by anything that Caraway had to offer him, and Caraway was using some pretty sophisticated switch-ups and setups. he was doing a good job of coming in with lots of different ways of going from wrestling to boxing and the other way around. And at a certain point, it didn't seem to throw Stamen off at all.
Yeah. So I was really confused by this fight because I did not watch it live. I was confused that it was a split decision. I was even more confused when I saw that there were a bunch of people who thought that Caraway had won, or that it had been a robbery.
Yeah.
That surprised me because I thought Stamen pretty clearly took the second and third. I thought he landed by far the cleaner, better shots in the second round, especially as that round was coming to an end. I thought in the third round, he outlanded Caraway like 2-1 in the third round. Aside from that last little takedown and like brief submission attempt that was not close.
And a flurry from Caraway came on strong. He did, what Caraway does. He put crazy pressure on at the end. But
he lost that exchange.
Yes,
like
agreed.
He got hit better and harder by Stamen, even in that last kind of pressuring exchange. Then I don't know. I was confused by that. But I thought you're absolutely right. I thought Stamen handled himself about as well as you could reasonably expect. And beyond that, Caraway looked good here. This was a good version of Caraway. His jab was great. Caraway did a great job of managing and setting distance early in the fight. He did a great job of distracting from his entries on his takedowns. The real test of somebody's takedown defense is, what do you do when a good wrestler is in deep on your hips, and Stamen still stuffed those shots? Like, there was nothing wrong with Caraway's shots here. He was not screwing up, and Stamen still stuffed him. That was incredibly impressive.
He only allowed 1 of 23 takedown attempts against Brian Caraway. I mean, that's really fucking impressive. I know people hate Brian Caraway, and that's why he was somehow like a sizable underdog going into this fight, which I wouldn't have expected for anyone else of Caraway's tenure and resume. He's good. He's really good. And really, like, he is the perfect gatekeeper in this division. If you can beat Brian Caraway, you deserve to compete with the elite of the elite. And Cody Stamen fought like, really, it was an intelligent fight against Brian Caraway. That was what really stood out, is that he was never shaken or distracted by what was happening. He was constantly aware that whatever Caraway was doing, he was going to be using it to set up his takedowns, and that he would then use the threat of a takedown to set up strikes, and he was just never surprised. It was like Stamen came in and had like he had a pretty limited array of defensive moves, but each move he used worked for a lot of things. He would move his back foot away first and just hop out of range. That covers a lot of the straight attacks. So long hooks, straight punches, the jab, you can deal with it that way and not have to be there for Caraway to then tie you up with a takedown. And then he would dip under things. He would just like drop, just bend his knees and sort of catch himself on the way down and dip under something and then come back with his left hook. Everything was a very short and explosive movement. Not the small steps that we love to talk about so much, but small explosive steps that kind of lead into other movements, other explosive movements. You know what I mean? Like, you sort of bounce to the side, and as you catch yourself from bouncing, you can spring back in the opposite direction with that Stamen left hook.
I'm interested to see where Stamen goes from here with this. I kind of wonder, this is not a fair assessment of him, but he seems very finished product to me, very finished product-y to me, which is weird because I know that he's not a finished product and that he's got he should still have a lot of room left to grow. He's only he's 28. He's been fighting as a pro for, let me look at this here. Let me pull this up.
He's had a decent career up to now, I think.
He's had a lot of fight. Okay, so he's a 6.5-year pro. So he's a prime fighter. You don't need to take it easy on him. You can. So he beat a guy who's in the top 10. You can give him a top 10 guy.
Sure. Yeah, I think he firmly announced himself as one of the elite contenders with this win. You give him anybody in the top 10, and I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So it's weird. I know intellectually that he still has room left to grow, but he seems like a guy who's there and ready for it. I don't know. Like, he's pretty athletic. He's got a pretty deep array of skills. He's got a pretty broad set of skills. He can do a few different things in there. I wonder how he's going to match up with the elite of this division. I think there's no reason for us not to find out.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, who? Let's see, who at bantamweight would be really tempting for Stamen to fight? This division's insane, Pat. There's too much good shit in this fucking division.
Yeah, I like a fight with Marlon Moraes. I think that'd be really fun.
Oh,
I think Jimmy Rivera would be a really fun matchup.
although I think both of those guys are now fighting each other at last.
Are they really?
Yeah, I think they made that for an upcoming main event some months down the road.
Great. Oh, yeah, I did not know that. See, this is the thing I don't know. I think if it were me, though, I'll tell you what I would do with Cody Stamen. I would give him John Dodson.
Sure.
I think that is the right fight to make because Dodson has some good name value. He's an interesting challenge. He's not going to be easily taken down. He's not going to be easy to beat on the feet. It would require a lot from Stamen's game to beat him, but I think Stamen can do it, and I think it would be the right kind of step up for him. And then you give him, like the Moraes Moraes Rivera winner if you need to, or that guy gets a title shot, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure. It probably wouldn't be super fun. I'm just imagining Stamen Dodson in my head, and I can definitely picture it being a very slow tactical fight. But I don't think it's one that Stamen has no chance of winning. His timing and his awareness really stood out in this fight, and obviously there's a massive difference in speed between somebody like Caraway and someone like John Dodson, but there's also a massive difference in variety. And like Dodson is, for all of his speed, a lot more predictable than somebody like than at least Caraway was in this fight, where I thought he did it. He was really tricky, and none of it threw Stamen off. None of all the yeah.
Well, Dodson fought on this card, and we're not gonna talk a lot about Dodson Munoz, but that was the first fight to me where I'm like, okay, Dodson is not the same dude anymore. I thought he looked more or less like himself in his last couple of fights up to this point, even though he's 33. He's been fighting as a pro since 2004. He's got a lot of mileage on him. I really think this was the first fight where I'm like, okay, Dodson's explosiveness is not there in the way that it used to be. And you saw that his shots did not have the same kind of pop on them. And that's because Dodson's power was entirely driven by his explosiveness.
Yeah, it was all speed.
Yeah.
It did look too like, although it kind of just looked like, from another perspective, a classic John Dodson performance. Where it was
classic
like
John Dodson performance, but without but with diminished physical gifts.
Yeah,
looks like exactly what we saw there.
Yeah, once again, unlike the Lineker fight and those glimmers of change we saw, once again back to the very one note, mostly just a left hand and a lot of footwork, except lacking the speed that once made that so tremendously effective. Yeah, I think you're probably right there. But let's not talk about that. We already talked about how much we love bantamweight. Let's not sour the mood, and let's have a few brief words, very very quickly here, on one of the biggest upsets on the card. Beneil Dariush has had a rough run. Has had a rough run lately, Pat. He stepped in here to fight Alexander Hernandez, who, how late was Hernandez's notice for this card?
Like a couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah, I'm just looking up now to see if it says. Bobby Green pulled out February 14th. So just a couple weeks ago, Alex Hernandez stepped in to replace Bobby Green. And there were only two ways this could go from the opening bell, because it was clear that this is what Hernandez wanted to do. He came out like a maniac. He ran across the octagon. Some people talked about a fake glove touch. I wasn't sure if I actually saw that or not, because he was literally running at Beneil Dariush. I think maybe Dariush mistakenly thought there was a glove touch coming, but Hernandez was coming out so aggressively that I kind of think he was just running out to kick Dariush. But he came at him so aggressively that as soon as I saw it, I was like, okay, he's going to knock Dariush out. I didn't think it was very likely. Or he's going to gas, and then Dariush is going to use veteran savvy to beat the shit out of him. And fortunately for Alex Hernandez, the first one happened. And that's kind of my read on this fight, is that he's lucky that Dariush didn't survive long enough to punish him for what looked like a far too aggressive approach to the opening seconds.
Yeah, that's true. But I think if you're a guy coming in on short notice against Beneil Dariush, that's the right way to fight him.
Sure.
Just get after him. I think there was a lot to like, I thought, about what we saw from Hernandez here. The big one being there was a fair bit of craft in what he showed off. Like that finishing combination, his head was offline for the counter that he thought was probably going to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know he's got power. You know, he's got pretty substantial power in his hands, but there was some real craft to that. It's an incredibly small sample size.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a very impressive little run there.
He also caught Dariush's head coming offline itself. Dariush was trying to do a slip cross counter, and small sample size again, but Hernandez did correctly predict where Dariush's head was going and caught him right in the center of the face with that straight left hand. So that's something. Mm-hmm. Do you feel now like, has your estimation of who Beneil Dariush is as a fighter changed? Because mine still really hasn't.
He was an overachiever, man.
Yeah. People are now saying like, oh, he's chinny now. But he's always not had a great chin, right? I mean, he got knocked out by Ramsey Nijam in his like first or second UFC fight. He got sat down by a really small shot from Michael Johnson, if I recall correctly, and knocked out. I mean, I don't know. He's always not been the most durable fighter in the world, and Hernandez hit him with an absolute belter, like a serious full-bodied cross right in the center of the face.
Yeah, I think the correct read on Beneil Dariush's career is, even leaving aside the chin issues, is that he is a guy who is not especially talented physically, who has absolutely maximized his gifts, you know? And he's done a lot with what he's been given. He's done a lot as a striker with relentless pressure and intelligence in his approach, and kind of his willingness to get in there and mix it up. Like he's done a lot with his grappling. He's done a lot in terms of being a pretty good wrestler. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have to look at Dariush and wonder what might have been with his skills. Like, that dude has maximized everything that he's been given. I think he's had a pretty good career, you know, but he's not like the fact that he had kind of worked his way up into the top 10 says a lot more about him maximizing what he's been given than his ceiling as a fighter. I think his actual ceiling as a fighter is kind of the fringes of the top 15. And by virtue of getting some lucky matchups and some big wins at the right times, we've seen him do more than we thought possible. The last 3 fights is kind of the regression to the mean of what his talent will allow for in the deepest division in the sport.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing, right? Like, he was on his way to beating Edson Barboza in one of those last 3 fights. Mm-hmm.
He always put himself in position to win.
Yeah. Yeah, he's just, he's not quite on par with someone like Edson Barboza. I don't think he can do that kind of thing, unless he's fighting like James Vick, somebody else who is not a tremendous athlete, or who is particularly susceptible to smaller guys getting right in their face. But for me, like, my estimation of Beneil Dariush doesn't really change at all. I think he has always been like a fringe top 10 guy, and he'll probably slot quite comfortably back into that role as long as he can recover from this loss with his confidence intact. I expect we will see more of what you might call vintage Beneil Dariush in the near future, and we'll all kind of, I don't know. What does this say about Alex Hernandez? That's my real concern. Does this now make Alex Hernandez a top 10 lightweight?
No. You give him...
But will that happen? Will they rank him?
I hope not. But I don't think Dariush was ranked after his last couple of fights, was he?
Maybe not. He may have been... We're just errantly searching for lots of information. I'll look it up.
Yeah, I would give Hernandez somebody like... I don't know. Like Dan Hooker?
He was ranked number 12, Beneil Dariush.
Yeah, that seems like a lot. I would give him somebody like Dan Hooker, or like Chris Gritzemacher.
Chris Gritzemacher, that'll work. Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah, somebody kind of in that range. You know the range I'm talking about. You know the range I'm talking about.
I know the range.
Like, or like Cajun Johnson.
Sure. Yeah. Although I do kind of shudder to think what might happen if Hernandez hit Cajun Johnson with the shot that knocked out Beneil Dariush.
It'd be ugly. Yeah, I don't think we don't need to contemplate that. But yeah, he seems like a talented young kid. So give him a kind of a durable veteran and see what he can do there. As for Dariush, like, I would not at all be surprised actually if he retired sooner rather than later, as opposed to taking beatings from guys. He's got a great jiu-jitsu pedigree. He's got what seems to be a pretty good school going. he doesn't need to be out here taking beatings for 50 grand, you know?
Yeah, and I'm fairly certain we mentioned his name as one of the fighters we would expect to make a very good coach. You know, based on his well-known intelligence and good-naturedness, the way he understands the game, and obviously how much he's been able to do with that understanding in lieu of what a lot of other fighters have, innate athletic talent. So, yeah, maybe retire Beneil. That wouldn't be so bad. Anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, we are going to talk very briefly about some boxing from last weekend. Wilder versus Ortiz happened, among a few other matches. We're going to spare a few words for that and then get on to some questions from our listeners after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we're back with Heavy Hands. Deontay Wilder fought Luis Ortiz over the weekend, and it was a weird fight, Pat. It was frequently compared to Anthony Joshua's fight with Vladimir Klitschko, which we also talked about on this show. And it was like a much worse version of that. And it didn't mean it wasn't fun to watch. It was just like watching Deontay Wilder have a similar experience versus Luis Ortiz to the one that Anthony Joshua had with Vladimir Klitschko, I don't think is a particularly good sign for Deontay Wilder.
It was a homeless man's version of Joshua Klitschko.
Yes, unfortunately,
it was, which is not to take anything away from Ortiz, who I thought fought Wilder about as well as he possibly could have. Mm-hmm. I thought Ortiz did a really good job. Ortiz did a great job of jabbing him, of keeping his lead foot outside. He did a great job of countering Wilder. He did a good job of getting inside Wilder's reach. Conversely, I think Wilder takes a lot of shit that is undeserved. I think that Wilder is not going to be the guy that people thought maybe he could be 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Wilder is who he is at this point. He's been fighting as a pro for 10 years, man, or like 9.5 years.
Yep.
Like, he is not some fucking raw prospect. Like, this is the dude. This is Deontay Wilder.
Deontay Wilder is like a C plus Prince Naz and Nassim Hamed. Yeah. And that's not too bad, considering that Prince Nassim is a C plus Roy Jones. So like that, but that's it. Like he's a weird, gangly, awkward, but very quick and athletic power puncher.
Who does things technically that play to his athleticism and his power, mm-hmm. right? Like he's not a totally craftless fighter, which I think is kind of the knock that he gets. Like, I don't know if you read, there was an article on Deadspin by Charles Farrell about basically how this fight was going to be a fix. Because Wilder sucks, and that's the only way that he beats Ortiz is if it's a fucking fix. And like that was a shit article. That was a bad article. They shouldn't have run it.
Grossly overestimates Luis Ortiz. Like he's not that good.
No, he's not that good, and Wilder, fine. Frankly, isn't that bad. Like
he's fine, and that's how the fight looked. It looked like somebody who was fine being beaten by somebody else who was fine. That's really what it was. And for all of that being said, it was a fairly exciting contest between two fine guys.
It was a well-matched fight.
Yeah.
For what it was.
Absolutely.
I thought the thing that Wilder does that actually deserves some credit as a technical gift is he changes rhythms and changes speeds. That's the one thing I think that he does that plays to his overall skill sets in ways that deserve some credit.
Lucy
like
agrees.
The way, Lucy's out there saying hi to God knows who. But he'll probe with the jab, he'll tap with the jab. Jesus fucking Christ, man. All right. Luce, stop it. Sit.
Quit screaming out the window that it was a fix, Lucy.
Yeah, Lucy real mad about Luis Ortiz. She had a lot of money on Ortiz. Yeah. And she was unhappy with the outcome.
Well, what can you do?
Yeah, sorry, we may want to edit that out. Yeah. So I think that's the one thing that Wilder does, and that is more or less, I think, what allowed him to start landing some power punches as this fight went on. Is he managed to lull Ortiz a little bit with the speed of the jab. He managed to lull him a little bit into not knowing what shot was going to come. I guess I don't know. It's like it's kind of hard to put a stamp on what Wilder does, but I thought Wilder actually did a pretty good job of jabbing here.
Yeah, it stretches, and other stretches he was shockingly inactive, more than he has been in a lot of other fights. It was weird though. Like it ended up kind of working to his advantage, in the way that you said. Like the sort of relative laziness of a lot of his movements especially the first few rounds of the fight, it made those first few really committed straight right hands really, really shocking. They were like thunderbolts out of the blue. Because, he was not just constantly going full speed, full force all the time. He didn't give Ortiz a chance to get used to what the full Wilder looks like, as it were.
That's kind of the key to Wilder's style working against elite level opposition. But there's so little elite level opposition out there at heavyweight. Like, are we ever going to find out whether that actually works? I mean, like, so he's going to fight Anthony Joshua probably, and he's going to get paid a bunch of money, and he's probably going to lose. So to you, what does that fight look like?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is like Wilder is, like, let's be honest. If Wilder is a heavyweight, if he's a C plus Naseem Hamed, there's some reason for that. I mean, he's 100 pounds more weighs 100 pounds more than Naseem Hamed, for example, and doesn't have Brendan Ingle in his corner either to give him a really systematic approach to this bizarre style. But for all that he's not quite Naseem Hamed, Anthony Joshua is not exactly Marco Antonio Barrera. He's got plenty of holes in his game as well. So, like, I really do think that there's still always a chance for somebody like Wilder to give serious problems to a guy like Joshua. Joshua does not have airtight defense. Defense is probably one of his least developed areas. He's really an offensively potent fighter. Like the thing with Wilder is he does so much crazy, bizarre shit with his winging punches and losing his footing and all that people then start to underrate how terrifying it can be when he lets go a laser straight right hand right down the pipe, and it just obliterates whatever it touches.
Ortiz looked shocked the first time Wilder threw one of those. He didn't land it, because Wilder is not an accurate puncher. But the first time Wilder let one of those go, you could see the shock on Ortiz's face. Like, holy shit, what was that? Yeah, what was that thing that was just flying toward my face? That's the Deontay Wilder factor. Yeah, I mean, the difference between Wilder and Joshua to me is that Joshua is improving. Like, yes. and Joshua, go on. In a rational sense, Joshua, he makes improvements from fight to fight, and you see, like, oh, this particular thing that was a weakness, he looks a little better at. Oh, his footwork is a little sharper. Oh, his jab is a little sharper. Oh, his sense of distance is a little bit improved. Whereas Wilder is like, you never really know. Yeah, is this better? Is this the thing he worked on? I don't know, maybe. Could be.
Probably not. Like maybe for one camp, maybe Wilder's style is one of whims. Rather than like a clear direction. He's just like, he looks like a fighter who maybe this camp he worked on the uppercut. Like his uppercut looked pretty good in this fight, better than it has in previous fights. Was one of the shots that finished it nice and tight and technical. But who knows if that'll still be there in his next fight.
You know what's going to happen, right?
What?
There's going to be huge hype and build up to this fight. Joshua is going to be pegged as the next big thing. He's going to be on the front page of every major sports site because he's got great publicists, and Eddie Hearn does a good job of promoting him. They're going to do all this shit. He's going to win 7 rounds, and in the 8th round, Deontay Wilder is just going to fucking club him with some shot. And all of this is going to come crashing down, and then it's Deontay Wilder, and then Wilder's going to go out and lose his next fight to like Povetkin or somebody.
Yeah,
that's what's going to happen here.
Somebody with objectively much less potential than Anthony Joshua. Yeah, I mean, I will say,
or Tyson Fury is just gonna get off his ass and get down to 300 pounds and just jab his way around Wilder for 12 rounds.
That is very likely. Tyson Fury is extremely legit, though. People forget that because he's so ridiculous. He's very, very good at what he does, even though it's not always fun to watch.
Yeah, I would pick. I think Tyson Fury would win every single round. He would win a 120 to 108 decision over Deontay Wilder.
I mean, just compared to Anthony Joshua's razor thin fight with Vladimir Klitschko, where he was in serious trouble. That kind of stuff didn't happen at all to Tyson Fury. Yes, the fight was boring, but he very, very clearly won it with almost no trouble. So yeah, that says a lot. I will say Anthony Joshua's got to have one big difference between him and most Wilder opponents is that Joshua is like as big as Deontay Wilder. His frame, but actually substantially more muscular and heavier. So that's an issue. Like Luis Ortiz was having a lot of success with that jab, and he is significantly shorter than Wilder. So, Anthony Joshua probably will have an opportunity to shock Wilder as well. But that's the thing with heavyweight, and especially with Wilder. He is a heavyweight, Pat. He's like, it doesn't matter that most of the game makes no sense and doesn't work. He really is a one-punch fighter, and that's kind of enough. So
it's a great punch.
It's a great fucking punch.
If you're going to be a one-punch fighter, you better have a great punch, and Wilder does.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Lee, you want to dig into these heavy bag questions?
Yeah, let's do it. I do want to give a shout-out, too, before we move on. If you haven't caught it from this weekend, in my mind, one of the most impressive things to watch from the whole weekend of combat sports was Dimitri Bivol versus Sullivan Barrera. I highly recommend you listening to this. Watch that if you want to see a light heavyweight who moves and counterpunches with the speed of a lightweight, then you should watch because, Dimitri Bivol is very, very exciting. Let's see. Our questions, Pat, our questions. We've got 3 from the heavy bag today. Our first one comes to us from Michael, who asks, guess who Michael is, Pat? Cuck Liddell, everyone's favorite Twitter account. Cuck Liddell wants to know what we think of Michael Chandler versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. I maintain, this is Michael / Cuck speaking. Should I not have said his actual name? Has that ruined the gimmick? I maintain he is the lightweight with the best chance of beating Khabib. What do you think of that?
I don't think any lightweight is going to beat Khabib, but if it's going to be one, I think it's Conor McGregor because he has the best chance of landing a flush counter that can actually put Khabib down.
Yeah.
I think Chandler would. I think Chandler would get blown out in about 2 rounds, just like pretty much everybody else. I think Chandler's athletic gifts and his power and his wrestling acumen give him a reasonable shot, but the same could also be said of a whole bunch of other lightweights who have and will lose to Khabib. So, yeah, I think the only guy who really has a shot to me is either Gaethje or it's McGregor. McGregor for the one punch, Gaethje for the ability to just not give a fuck about whatever Khabib is doing to him. Like, otherwise, no, I think Chandler would fight an entirely predictable fight, get mashed up against the fence, get taken down a whole bunch of times, and lose. There's nothing about Chandler's game that says to me that he would be a particularly difficult matchup.
I'm kind of willing to entertain this one. Because we were talking the last time we talked about Khabib, we were starting to think like maybe it's going to take somebody who's a really strong wrestler to compete with him. Somebody who doesn't take the tack of, well, if he grapples me, I'm dead, so I have to strike with him and knock him out. Maybe it's going to take somebody who like can actually hang with most of the people they face in the tie-ups, in the clinches against the fence. And that's why we tagged Gaethje as like someone who just doesn't give a shit, but is also like a strong clinch fighter who is happy to tie up with people and strain against them. And I don't know, Michael Chandler has some of that. He's we also talked about Kevin Lee, right? Like somebody who can competitively grapple with Khabib, and Chandler has some of that.
I think that's the wrong tack, though. The tack is you need to stay away from him. But if you can't stay away from him, you need to be willing to engage on your terms instead of his terms in those kinds of tie-ups. I think that's a subtle difference there. I don't see Chandler being able to do the first part because you can't. You're just going to plant your feet in the middle of the cage and throw at Khabib. He'll duck under and blast you off your feet. Are you going to try to pressure him back? That's not going to work. We've seen people try to do that before, and it doesn't last very long. I really think that Khabib is as close to unbeatable as you're going to find. And like, there's nothing in particular that stands out to me about Chandler. Sure, he can wrestle. So can a whole bunch of other guys that Khabib has beaten. Like, Rafael dos Anjos can wrestle. How'd that go?
Yeah, yeah. Chandler's real strong, but, so RDA was too.
There are lots of good, strong. Michael Johnson is a pretty good defensive wrestler. He's who's a pretty strong guy.
But he's also like, Chandler can hang better on the ground than Michael Johnson can by a long shot.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think, like, I've always thought of Michael Chandler as a pretty generic fighter. He just does not stand out to me in any particularly special way. I don't know. This is not hating on Michael Chandler, I guess. I just don't see him as like a top 8 lightweight, period. So I don't know why you would, if you were going to pluck a guy, I'd be like, yeah, Chandler, that's the dude.
I beg to differ a little bit, but it's okay to disagree, Pat. Sometimes we can disagree. I think Michael Chandler probably belongs in the top 10, in the top 2/3 of the top 10 at least. Just from athletic talent, sure. Almost. But okay, let's. Cuck.
But he's not like a better athlete than Kevin Lee is. He's not a better athlete in terms. He's not faster than Edson Barboza is.
No,
he's not faster than Michael Johnson is. Like,
no, but he's stronger than those guys are. In addition to being almost as fast.
I don't think he's stronger than Kevin Lee is.
No, not stronger than Kevin Lee, but he's a nice middle road between the Kevin Lees and the Edson Barbozas. He's quite quick and explosive, but he's also quite physically strong. And also, skill-wise, a pretty good counterpuncher, a hard hitter, and a very capable defensive and offensive wrestler. I don't know. I think there's something there. But we'll probably never, ever get the chance to see it. So it's not worth spending too much time arguing over. But Mr. Liddell, our condolences to your wife, and thank you for the question. Let's move on now to one from Ian. Ian asked us on Patreon. If you want a question answered on the show, by the way, $5 patrons are the people whose questions we're answering right now. $5 a month on Patreon. That's all it takes to have questions answered on here. So this one is from Ian, who gave us $5. And Ian asks, at what point of their careers should fighters rely less upon their athletic gifts and more upon tactics and strategy to win fights? Should young fighters be taught to prioritize round-winning strategies at an early stage of their career, or should they be allowed to fight in whichever manner they find most comfortable and work this tactics in it as they progress fight to fight?
That's a good question. I think the answer you get is going to vary from coach to coach.
Yeah.
Some coaches are really big on their curriculum, on the things that they think everybody needs to learn at particular stages. So like Henry Hooft has a curriculum. Firas Zahabi has a curriculum. I think other coaches, I think guys like Greg Jackson are less concerned with all of the different things than like kind of letting you flow in your own particular individualistic way. I think Rafael Cordero kind of lets you do tactics wise whatever you feel most comfortable with, as long as it's within a kind of a set of strictures. It's going to vary based on who you're talking to here, and I think they can both work. They offer different strengths and weaknesses. I think the curriculum guys who are kind of set that this is the thing we're going to learn at this particular point in time, and this is the way we're going to try to fight this particular opponent based on these particular kind of precepts. That can be hard when you know more than a little bit, but you don't know a ton. I think we see a lot of guys struggle at that particular stage where they think they know what they want to do, but they don't have all the tools necessary to do it yet. Whereas I think the guys who kind of flow along from fight to fight can run into trouble later in their careers as they get figured out a little bit, or there are still holes in their game. There are still whole skill sets that they're missing, things like that.
It perhaps leaves you more open to be to essentially have an opponent figure you out before you've figured yourself out. That the opponent can teach you what your shortcomings are because you haven't spent enough time investing in, discovering and then correcting those shortcomings.
Yeah, I think we kind of saw that with Cody Stamann versus Tom Duquesnoy.
Sure.
Like we hit a point where we saw the limits of what Duquesnoy knew what to do or felt comfortable doing, and he had an opponent who knew more than him and figured out one particular skill set weakness that Duquesnoy had, defensive wrestling, and figured out how to make that work for him to win a 3-round fight. Like, I think those dudes who just kind of flow, there's a way to beat them, especially early on. Whereas the other guys, they may like. I don't know that I really have a preference. I think it depends on the coach. I think it depends on the fighter and the kind of mix you get between the two.
I think it's also potentially a bit of a false dichotomy. That, like the question is, should young fighters be taught to prioritize round-winning strategies, or should they be allowed to fight in whichever manner they want? And it's often like both things are happening at once. Often young fighters are being taught long-term round-winning strategies, and they just don't show up in the fights until they've really become comfortable with those skills. I would say under those circumstances, it's still worth starting to teach them those skills as soon as possible, while still allowing them to operate as they're comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of build on that a little bit, you hit on something really important, which is that a fight is a small sample size.
Yeah.
You are not seeing in a fight everything a fighter is working on or has worked on. You're not seeing all of that play out in that 15 or 25 minutes or less. Yeah. There are lots of things that fighters know how to do that they don't do for whatever reason, either because it doesn't fit the opponent, they don't think it fits the opponent, or they don't entirely feel comfortable doing it. Like, if you were to watch Verdum in a sparring session in like 2011, you would see him do things that he didn't do in an actual fight until 2014 or 2015. Like, guys have skills that they learn in the gym, and they learn that it takes a long time for them to actually feel comfortable letting go and doing.
Sure.
So
Verdum's a great example. I mean, he himself didn't realize he was capable of outstriking Alistair Overeem when he started to do it in their first fight. Even though he clearly had the skills to put some damage on Overeem on the feet, he had not yet become fully confident in those skills. So, I think there's something there. And there's something there with the way that matchmaking develops fighters as well, that MMA fans I don't think really think about the same way like boxing fans, for example, do. I know I love to parallel boxing and MMA, but in MMA we don't have an environment. The sport does not create an environment in which their managers are selecting matchups for them specifically to help them show the things that they have been working on in the gym. Instead, it's like, they just get surprised. It's like matchups are random, handed down from above, and the fighters just have to do with it what they can. So it's just a little bit of a different environment. All right, one more question. And, well, for this one, I have to play a sound effect because it has been specifically requested. Josh asks, in parentheses, please include sound effect. Oh my God. That was our sound effect. Hold on a sec, Pat. Did you like that?
I didn't hear anything.
Oh, it was like very slow. Let's try it again. Josh asks, in parentheses, please include sound effect. And Josh asks, maybe this is recency bias, but do you think that it's becoming harder to predict the outcomes of matches? If so, what can you attribute this to? Increased depth to move away from single discipline fighters, i.e. less striker versus wrestler matchups, etc. Do you think it's becoming harder to predict the outcome of MMA fights, Pat?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I think MMA in general is becoming more complicated.
Sure.
For a while, like there were kind of hacks that you could work around because you're right to point out the striker versus grappler, or wrestler versus grappler, or wrestler versus striker, or whatever. Those archetypes don't hold up. Lots of people can do lots of different things.
Yeah.
For a long time, the kind of workaround was pace. That what really was setting people apart was how fast are they working? What pace do they feel comfortable pushing? How many takedowns can they attempt? How many strikes can they throw? And that was a really good kind of workaround for this. Was like I think we're kind of out of the pace era now. Everybody's gas tanks pretty much have improved. Very rare you see fighters getting so tired that they gas out in the third round of a fight now. Everybody pretty much knows what that's going to require cardio-wise. So I don't think at this point there's a hack that we figured out that gives you that feels like it's working and is a particularly important variable. Basically, if there were, our percentage of picks would probably be a little bit better. It probably would be, yeah. Basically, when I say a hack, what I mean is a variable that you put into your kind of matrix for what you think matters in predicting the outcome of a fight that you can weight more than others. it's hard right now to find a single variable that you can point to, or even a couple of variables to point to. Striking has gotten more complicated too. I mean, is this person a particularly good counterpuncher? What's their footwork like? How do those factors play together? How does their striking play together with their wrestling or their grappling? What chance do they have of finishing a fight? Are they particularly dangerous? How do they finish fights? There are a lot of things that go in, and there are no quick workarounds at this point. So I do think it's kind of becoming a little bit harder, and I think you can see people's pick percentages fall a little bit.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like, I haven't really paid attention to the trend because I've always had ups and downs with making correct predictions, and sometimes I'll have a bad stretch, and sometimes I'll have a very good stretch, and typically I just have a decent stretch. But maybe like there is it does feel like the sport is still kind of in flux, that we have not yet. We've not yet hit an era in which we have like, oh, these are the set styles of fighters. Like now we have two guys like Yoel Romero and Brian Ortega, of a mold that I find very difficult to understand. I think we've kind of over time begun to hit upon a few more of the keys to help explain how their styles work and how their minds work in a fight. But still, like that going for the finish is such a viable style of fighting in MMA does make it kind of hard to understand how a matchup's dynamics are going to play out. That you have somebody who, I don't know, it's not a kind of style you see in boxing where you can say like, okay, the outfighter is going to beat this journeyman pressure fighter pretty easily because the journeyman pressure fighter can't cut off the ring. Bada boom, that's it. That's the prediction. I understand how this fight's going to look, and you're probably not going to surprise me. And yeah, that's really hard to do with guys like Brian Ortega, or even like the lesser versions of them, as you said before, like Ricardo Lamas. How do you predict a Ricardo Lamas fight when his technique is like shaky enough on a move to move level that he can get caught cold by Josh Emmett with a perfect left hook, and just being totally out of position and getting caught, but also can finish many of the elite fighters in the world because he's got such a great eye for finding those openings himself. It's hard to call those kinds of fighters. I don't know if that's new though. And maybe it's just the fact that all along MMA has been a sport where you can finish anyone anywhere at any time. And so it's always been really difficult to predict compared to other sports. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, this is why, it's just, I do think it's getting a little harder. I think that all of that is right. It's a more complicated sport than it's ever been before.
Mm-hmm. Already a complicated sport, getting more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for your questions. Thanks very much. I know that's the ending on, is not maybe the best answer in the world, but it's a tough topic. Yeah. Well, okay. So that's it for the show. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Before we wrap up and head out, I would like to hear from you, Pat. What do you have coming out this week?
I have a new episode of Tides of History coming out this week on the printing press.
Nice.
And I think that's about it. I'm just kind of working away here.
Rock and roll. All right.
What are you doing?
Well, as for me, I think I'm going to publish something on Dimitri Bivol because I really, really enjoyed his dominant win over Sullivan Barrera last weekend. So if I have time, that is what I'm going to be writing about. Taking advantage of this little break from the weekly UFC cards to look at some boxing, because I do love it so, and I miss talking about it, as you might be able to tell from it constantly slipping into my discussion on this show. Otherwise, I think that's it, and that means that's it for the show. So, if you guys want to find us online with your comments, concerns, questions, criticisms, or whatever, and if you don't mind being occasionally muted, if it's more of the criticism side, then you should find us both on Twitter. You can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman, myself at Boxing Bush, that's BUSCH. You can also find us both on Facebook.com/either Patrick Wyman MMA or Connor Ruebusch MMA. Check out Pat's work on Deadspin. Make sure you check out Tides of History. And find my fight analysis on Bloody Elbow. Since I'm publishing boxing this week, I hope, you can also find my work on badlefthook.com, though it's been a little while since I've written there. And that's it. So, thank you all for tuning in once again. We'll see you next week. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.